Thank you. All right. If you could turn this one on. That's okay. I really don't know that I need two screens today, but that's okay. Anyways, we will be continuing on in Exodus 2, starting at verse 11. And let's see, Exodus 2 focuses really on the first 40 years or so of Moses' life. At the end of it, he's probably a little bit into his 40s, but it's roughly the first 40 years of his life. The first 10 verses being his birth and God's provision for his protection, and really the blessing that God gives to his parents and him because of his parents' faith and fear of God as opposed to their fear of Pharaoh. 11 to 22 we'll be focusing in on today, and this looks at, pretty much picks up after Moses is in his late 30s, possibly even 40 years old, as the book of Exodus is fairly silent as far as Moses' childhood, early adulthood, in Pharaoh's court and being educated as an Egyptian royal and the privileges that went along with that, and pretty much jumps from his naming in verse 10 to him being late 30s, early 40s. And this is actually not unusual from a literary standpoint for literature of that time, that they would include for an important character, an important individual, a backstory on their birth, but then would jump to where things get important, so to speak, and skip over things in between. To some extent, we see that in Jesus' life. There's more details about his birth, very little in between until he's in his early 30s and his ministry, other than what the account in Matthew of him as a boy in the temple teaching the individuals there and then marveling at his knowledge for his age. Other than that, there's very little in between there. And it's the same thing here. Something also that I didn't mention when we were going through the ties between the book of Exodus and the 18th dynasty is evidently a lot of the literature style in Exodus and a lot of how the book is structured and idioms used echo into 18th century Egyptian writing. And this would make sense because God used Moses to write this. And Moses had a lot of education within the Egyptian royal court. So some of that literary style would show up in his writing. And that's one of kind of the evidences that Exodus and the 18th dynasty line up, is that literally it makes sense from that standpoint. So 11 to 22, we have Moses is now late 30s, possibly 40 years old, and he attempts to start a deliverance. And instead, this goes very badly, and he's exiled and ends up being exiled in Midian for 40 years before it's God's time to call Moses to deliver the Israelites in God's power as opposed to Moses' power. And then Exodus 2 wraps up with this kind of light of hope where it's mentioned in verses 23 to 25, God shows up and God remembers. Up to that point, God has been fairly silent in the book of Exodus. And not silent because he's absent, but silent because the time wasn't right for him to take action in calling somebody to deliver his people. So let's start in verse 11, Exodus 2, verse 11. Now it came to pass in those days when Moses was grown, that he went out to his brethren and looked at their burdens. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So he looked this way and that way. And when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. And when he went out the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting. And he said to the one who did the wrong, "Why are you striking your companion?" And then he said, "Who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian?" So Moses feared and said, "Surely this thing is known." And when the Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. So in verse 11, we have Moses as an adult, likely at late 30s, early 40s, so not even a young adult at this point. He has been taught and learned and is part of Pharaoh's royal court. And he goes out to a work site. And in verse 11, it's stressed he is not going out to the work site as an Egyptian to see how the work is going. It's not as a member of Pharaoh's royal family going out to this work site. It's stressed he went out to his brethren. And he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his brethren. So his brethren is mentioned twice to emphasize that. And just in case the reader isn't sure who Moses' brethren is, it's defined as not an Egyptian, a Hebrew. And so here we see that Moses is very much identifying as a Hebrew, as an Israelite, and identifies that even though he's in Pharaoh's court, he doesn't consider himself an Egyptian. Even before he's exiled, he is already distancing himself from Pharaoh, from the Egyptians, and from basically what he's grown up in. And keep in mind, his first 4 or 5 years, he grew up in his mother and father's home. And I didn't put the reference into here, but this is kind of an application of train up a child. And when he is grown, he will not depart from his ways. Often we see in the Old Testament these kind of colorful stories that illustrate other biblical principles that are stated in a more concise and clear way, either in the New Testament or in the Proverbs or somewhere like that, in one of the wisdom books in the Old Testament, the Proverbs or in Ecclesiastes or something like that. And here we kind of see that despite the fact that he grew up very much as a privileged Egyptian, he is not departing from what he was taught at a very young age. Thought I had a verse in here. Let's see. There we go. By Hebrews 11, by faith, Moses, when he became of age, refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter, choosing rather to suffer affliction with the people of God than to enjoy the passing pleasure of sin. So Hebrews 11, verses 24 and 25, fill in a bit more detail than we see here in Exodus 2, verse 11. But they go together. In verse 11, it's showing us by saying he went out to see his brethren and looked on his brethren, that what's written about in Hebrews is true. When he became of age, he refused to be called the son of Pharaoh's daughter. He distanced himself from his heritage as an adopted Egyptian. Not only that, some commentators see in this an implication that Moses, because he's going out to look on his brethren, is not going out just as far as curiosity or as an overseer from the Egyptian side of things, but is very much going out of compassion because he knows they're enslaved, and he's specifically wanting to see this as an opportunity to assist and to free his brethren and start a revolt or start a movement against this injustice that he sees. Which would explain why in verse 12, he looks this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. So he's seeing this injustice against his brethren. He's seeing this injustice, and he wants to take action against it. And part of his action here He's not using his power as part of an individual in the Egyptian royal court. Because he could have fired this taskmaster. He could have told him to stop. He could have had him beaten. He could have done any of those things, but instead he decides to kill the Egyptian. Now, unfortunately, here, his motives and his drive, he recognizes that he is in a unique place. He may even recognize that God is going to call him as a deliverer, and that he's in a unique place in his people and his brethren, in that the rest of the male population is enslaved and being beaten, and he's not. And he is in a position where he potentially can do something. But here, unfortunately, he tries in his own power to defend and to deliver Israel. He's challenging injustice, but he's doing it in a way that opens him up to charges of doing wrong, because he's choosing to kill this individual. And it's clear from verse 12, he knows what he's doing is wrong. Because if he was doing something that he knew was moral and just and God-fearing, he would not have looked this way and that way, and when he saw no one, he killed the Egyptian. He knows it's wrong. And this is maybe kind of an application for us here, that before we do something, if we're furtively looking around to see if anybody's watching, we maybe should reconsider what we're doing. Because if we're doing something that we don't want anybody else to see, we may be doing something that we shouldn't be doing. Now, I suppose there's some exceptions to somebody doing something good and altruistic for somebody else, and they don't want to have praise lauded on them. They just want to quietly help that person. But that's different than here. He certainly is wanting to help the Hebrews being beaten, but he's looking this way and that because he knows he's about to take someone's life. And he's doing it at this point not only in his power, but he's also doing it in his timing. He's not doing it in God's timing. God is going to call him to be a deliverer, but the timing isn't right yet. We saw that in the Gospel of John, where Jesus mentioned his hour wasn't come yet. His hour wasn't come yet. If the Son of God recognizes that he does not act outside of God the Father's timing, Moses certainly shouldn't be stepping outside that timing, and we also shouldn't be stepping outside that timing. There may be things that we know are good things that God wants us to do, but we have to be careful that we don't do them in our strength and our timing, that we wait for God's strength and God's timing. And it's not that we just sit back and do nothing to wait, but rather that a clue that it's our timing is if we're looking this way and that way to make sure nobody's seeing this occur. Later in Exodus, God gives the law to the Israelites. And this is a foundation of law for the Israelites to build their nation on, that is based on godly moral principles, because this is God's law handed through Moses to the Israelites. And in it is emphasized both justice and mercy. Both acts of love from God. Mercy being an act of love that God gives to somebody who deserves punishment. Justice being an act of love that God gives to the victim of crime. Justice is just as much an act of love as mercy is. And part of that law in Exodus 21:23, but if any harm follows, then you shall give life for life, eye for eye, tooth for tooth, hand for hand, foot for foot, burn for burn, wound for wound, stripe for stripe. And one might think in a casual reading of that, or the popular interpretation of that, that that's what Moses is doing. Because often the eye for eye principle is twisted and thought to be this brutal, vengeance-based judgment. It's not. It's about justice. It's about that the punishment should fit the crime. This Egyptian was beating a Hebrew. That's not really a capital punishment. Moses, even though he didn't have this law yet, was overstepping justice by committing murder here. He wasn't doing an eye for an eye here. He was doing a life for a beating. There are some who think, well, in Near Eastern culture where there's a thief and they cut off their hands, that's an example of eye for an eye. No, that's a complete example of breaking the eye for an eye principle. A loaf of bread theft for a hand is not an even justice. It's not justice, it's brutal vengeance at that point. And so I think it's kind of ironic that here very likely when Moses was given this principle for an eye, he had to be thinking back and thinking, oh, he wasn't following that principle when he did this action against this Egyptian. So not only was it not in God's timing, not only was it in Moses' method, it was completely contrary to the principles of justice that God was going to lay down through Moses later on. Moses wasn't ready yet to be the spiritual leader and the lawgiver to the Israelites. And his own brethren recognize this. He doesn't, but his own brethren do. In verse 13, and when he went out the second day, behold, 2 Hebrew men were fighting. And he said to the one who did the wrong, why are you striking your companion? And then he said, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? So even though Moses did his best to look this way and that way and make sure nobody was watching, he probably didn't realize that the Hebrew who was being beaten with the Egyptian was a witness most likely and was still there. Because unless he waited until the beating was done and then followed the Egyptian to where he was alone and then killed him, since he was observing an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, very likely when he looked this way and that way and saw no one was there, in his mind he was looking for Egyptians. But yet, the victim of the Egyptian beating was likely there. So likely the word got out not because of an Egyptian saw him, but because one of his brethren saw him and spread the word. That guy Moses, who is one of us, who now lives in Pharaoh's court, he's going around killing people. He's a law unto himself, and then he hides them in the sand. We don't know for sure who got the word out, but it's very likely the word got out through the other Hebrews, through his brethren. And you might wonder, why would they share that? Well, they're the ones who are being beaten by that slave taskmaster, who was just killed and buried in the sand. Now, unless Moses buried him really deep, a windy day, that body's going to get uncovered. That body gets uncovered, and there's going to be an investigation. And very quickly, the primary suspects will be the slaves, the Israelite slaves, who that taskmaster was overseeing and was beating. And very likely in that culture, they're not going to spend a lot of time investigating that. And so very quickly, the light is going to shine on those Israelite slaves who are under that taskmaster, who already have things very hard. And so it would be very logical for them to be very concerned that this guy Moses has just gone rogue and made things worse for them, because they are going to pay the penalty for what he did, because he's part of Pharaoh's royal court. And so when he goes to stop them fighting, their retort to him is to stop fighting with each other and turn to him and be like, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptian? He recognizes that what Moses did was to kill somebody who was beating somebody else, and that Moses might be going to do that to him. He's also rejecting Moses here. In verse 11, it was stressed that Moses has rejected the Egyptians and is identifying as an Israelite and a Hebrew. His people are not ready to accept him, though. Because here, like, who made you a prince and judge over us? You're a prince of Egypt. You're not a prince of Israel. You're a judge of Egypt. You're not a judge of Israel. Now, ironically, God is going to, some 40 years later, call Moses. So here, kind of a double irony here. In the first hand, they're kind of rejecting him, even though he's trying to protect them. But later, we see in Hebrews, well, that's not the verse I wanted. There we go. Exodus 18:13. And so it was on the next day that Moses sat to judge the people, and the people stood before Moses from morning until evening. And here, though, by Exodus 18, Moses has been called and appointed judge by God. And so in verse 18, he could answer the question, who made you a prince and a judge over us? By saying, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, the God who is and who has always been, the great I am, has given Moses that authority. But in Exodus 2, he can't say that yet. And so here we have, though Moses wants to identify with his brethren don't yet want to identify with him. And this is why Moses fears. In verse 14, then he said, who made you a prince and a judge over us? Do you intend to kill me as you killed the Egyptians? So Moses feared and said, surely this thing is known. And when Pharaoh heard of this matter, he sought to kill Moses. But Moses fled from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. Now, if we're not careful reading that, we might think that Moses feared Pharaoh and Moses feared being killed by Pharaoh, and so he fled to Midian. Now, certainly he fled to Midian because he didn't want to get killed. But the order of the wording is very specific here. His fear comes at the rejection of his brethren, not at Pharaoh's attempt to kill him. And this is reinforced by Hebrews. Wow, my slides are out of order today. Sorry about that. By faith, he forsook Egypt, not fearing the wrath of the king, for he endured as seeing him who is invisible. In Hebrews, Moses is stated to not fear the Pharaoh and not fear the wrath of the king. And so if in Exodus Moses is fleeing because he fears Pharaoh, then the Bible contradicts itself. And some point that out as a contradiction in Hebrews and Exodus. Well, Moses feared Pharaoh and ran off and hid, and here by faith he didn't fear him. What's the deal with that? Well, the deal is Moses is not fearing the wrath of Pharaoh. He fears the rejection of his own people. This is why in verse 11 it's emphasized he went to see his brethren. He went to see his brethren. He went to do something for his brethren. And his brethren turn around and say, who are you? You're not one of us. And so he realizes that he's been rejected by his own people. And he has rejected Pharaoh's court and the Egyptians. He is now truly a foreigner in a foreign land who his own people are rejecting, and the people who adopted him, he's rejected and are about to reject him, because along with his people rejecting him, once word gets to the Pharaoh that he's the guy who killed and buried that Pharaoh taskmaster, and especially since very likely if this is the 18th Egyptian dynasty, at this point, Pharaoh's daughter has died, and the next Pharaoh is the one who tries to wipe her memory out of Egyptian culture and wipe out those who are related to her. Moses now has a huge target on his back because this Pharaoh is looking for an excuse to get rid of him. And possibly because, as Pharaoh's daughters, Pharaoh's full royal daughter's adopted son, he could possibly have a claim to the throne as a pharaoh. There are some who think that maybe he may have had a legitimate possible claim to that throne. And that wouldn't be particularly far-fetched, because the 16th and the 17th dynasty, the pharaohs who were most powerful were Semitic, not Hebrew nationals. So there had been Semitic pharaohs, and it very well could have been. Though in Exodus here in verse 11, it very much makes it clear that Moses had no designs to become Pharaoh, because he was identifying as an Israelite with his brethren and was disowning Egypt. But Thutmose III, the Pharaoh, the very young Pharaoh who had been co-regent with Hatshepsut since he was 2 years old, and saw Moses growing up and being a very popular son of Hatshepsut, he may have seen Moses as being a threat. And now that he sees, oh, he's killed an Egyptian taskmaster. He's disowned us. He's claiming to be an Israelite. Let's go get him. He has lost his right to protection as a royal. And so we have in verses 11 to 12, tries to start deliverance of the Israelites in his own power. And not only does he fail, he is rejected by his own people in trying to defend them, because they don't understand what he's doing, and because he's doing it wrong in his own power. He is not doing it in God's power. If we think back to Shiphrah and Puah in verse 1, they feared God, and they tried to deliver, literally, deliver the male babies alive. But they did it in a way that what they were doing, they didn't have to look one way and that way and do it in secret so much. They didn't have to do it in fear because they feared God and were doing it in the right way. Same with Moses' mother and his father and his sister, when they defied Pharaoh by not throwing him into the river to die, but put him in the river to live in an ark. They also did it in a way that was a correct and moral way. So he's rejected by his people, and in the verse 13, he flees from the face of Pharaoh and dwelt in the land of Midian and sat down by a well. So quick map here. Midian would be further east of Egypt, and for the east of the Sinai Desert. And the Midianites were a nomadic people. So they at times would take their sheep into the Sinai area in order to graze them, as far as looking for water and better vegetation at higher elevation in the Sinai Peninsula. And they were kind of distant relatives of the Israelites, in that they were descendants of Abraham through Abraham's wife Keturah. For most of their history, they were mostly enemies of Israel. Now, in this case, though, because Egypt was a really big enemy of Midian, an Egyptian exile showing up, even though he was an Israelite, because he was exiled by Egypt, a nation and country that many times had tried to overrun Midian and take over Midian. Because this was somebody who was fleeing Egypt, very likely they would have accepted Moses as a kindred spirit, in that they had a common enemy, Egypt, at that point. Even though we're going to see that when they first ran into Moses, Zipporah's daughters, they thought he was an Egyptian. But they did recognize that he was exiled, and so because of that, he was welcomed in, because he was a bigger enemy. Where exactly in Midian he fled to, because they were a nomadic people, we don't know. It could have even been in the Sinai Peninsula itself, as depending on what time of year it was, and they're moving around with their sheep, which well they were going to, which land they were grazing. But that's kind of the general area in kind of the northwest region of modern Saudi Arabia, which would be the land of Midian, and then their grazing area would overlap into Sinai. Now the priest of Midian had 7 daughters, and they came and drew water, and they filled the troughs to water their father's flock. And then the shepherds came and drove them away. But Moses stood up and helped them and watered their flock. So here we have, even though Moses is now in exile because he tried to stand up and help some individuals, he still is an individual who clearly has a desire to stand up for injustice and to protect individuals. Because here, he's resting at a well. He sees these 7 women coming with their herd of sheep. He sees another group of shepherds come and drive these women away. And he stands up, drives the shepherds away, and assists the women in watering their flock. And so when they came to Reuel, their father, he said, "How is that you have come so soon today?" So evidently, it was a regular occurrence that these women, when they got to the well, had to basically wait until everybody else had gotten their water, and then finally they would have a shot at the water. And their father, Reuel, also called Jethro in the book of Exodus. Jethro is likely his title as a Midian priest, kind of like Pharaoh is a title. Jethro is likely his title, and Reuel is likely his given name. He questions them, "How is it you've come so soon today?" And they say, "An Egyptian delivered us." So somewhat ironically, this passage starts in verse 11 with Moses very much wants to distance himself from Egypt and be considered an Israelite, and the Israelites reject him, and these Midianite women think he's an Egyptian. An Egyptian delivered us from the hand of the shepherds, and also drew enough water for us and watered the flock. And so they explain, this Egyptian drove away these other shepherds. And their father's response is one of a bit of shock. As he says to his daughters, "Where is he? Why is it that you have left the man? Call him that he may eat bread." Reuel is like, "Daughters, haven't I raised you better? We're nomadic. We are very hospitable people. When somebody helps you, you don't leave them alone for the shepherds to gang up and come back and beat him up, because he would have recognized this man as an Egyptian." They said he was an Egyptian. Egyptians aren't well favored in Midian, and not only that, Egyptians look down on shepherds. They show shepherds as being, and so very much here, he's just chased away some shepherds. When he's alone, there's a very good risk that they're going to go get more of their friends and come back. And he's like, "Why didn't you bring him with us?" And so evidently they go back and get him. And Moses was content to live with the man, and he gave Zipporah, his daughter, to Moses. So we have the importance of some more women that God uses in order to preserve Moses and to give him a home in his exile in Midian. And he becomes a shepherd. And later we're going to see Zipporah steps up to save Moses from the wrath of God. And she bore him a son. He called his name Gershom, for he had said, I have been a stranger in a foreign land. And something that's kind of remarkable of that name there, Gershom, is later in Exodus and also in Deuteronomy, under the Mosaic law, God tells the Israelites, you shall neither mistreat a stranger nor oppress him, for you were strangers in the land of Egypt. And we see Moses recognizing he's a foreigner and a stranger. He is a ger in the land of the Midianites. But he was also a stranger in Egypt. And God is going to call him to become a leader of a people. And he's going to use him to deliver his people out of Egypt, where they are foreigners and strangers who are being mistreated. And as part of God's law that he gives to the Israelites, he tells them specifically, do not mistreat strangers and foreigners in your land, because you once were strangers and foreigners. And the reason for that is Israel was supposed to be this people that was set apart to be a light to people, that they would come to the promised land and see something special and see who Jehovah God was through them. And if they were to mistreat them, that would kind of work against that. And this is completely opposite of what Pharaoh was doing. Pharaoh was completely mistreating the foreigners. That is, Egyptian pharaohs that did this were some of the first, if not the first, anti-Semitic individuals who were oppressing the foreigners, in this case, the Israelites. But we see throughout history how other reigns have mistreated foreigners. And God is saying to the Israelites, that's not what you're supposed to do. And Moses is starting to recognize he's a stranger in a foreign land in this Midianite home. I'm going to pick up with verse 23 next time, the hope of God, and carry into Exodus 3. But I think I should wrap up and stop there. Dear Heavenly Father, we thank you for these words. Help us to recognize your call, your timing, and your way, rather than stepping out in our timing and our way as Moses did here. But we should also recognize that despite the fact that Moses made these mistakes, it didn't disqualify him. It was something that you used as a learning experience for him, and used that later when you did call him, you used him mightily. In Jesus' name.